Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Deputy Chief Academic Officer for Friendship Public Charter School, Dr. Tanya Green.
Thank you. Good morning. Back in the late 1980s, Colin Powell talked about success with Ebony magazine. He said success is the result of perfection, hard work, learning from failure, loyalty, and persistence. Those qualities perfectly describe our esteemed keynote speaker. Christopher Emdin is an associate professor in the Department of Mathematics, Science, and Technology at Teachers College, Columbia University, where he also serves as Director of Science Education at the Center for Health Equity and Urban Science Education. He is currently a Caperton Fellow and Hip Hop Archive Fellow at the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Harvard University. Dr. Emdin holds a PhD in urban education with a concentration in mathematics, science, and technology, graduate degrees in both natural sciences and education administration, and undergraduate degrees in physical anthropology, biology, and chemistry. He is the creator of both the hashtag HipHopEd social media movement and the Science Genius Project, and was recently recognized as a STEM Access Champion of Change by the White House. Dr. Emdin writes the provocative Emdin 5 series on a number of contemporary social issues for the Huffington Post. He is also the author of the award-winning book, Urban Science Education for the Hip Hop Generation. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to present our keynote speaker, Dr. Christopher Emdin.
Good morning, everyone. You guys are turning up earlier, so I'm gonna have you, I have to turn up for me as well. So good morning, everyone. Good morning. All right, so I just want to start off by saying how much of an honor it is to be here to share some words with you today, and then to remind you that what I like to do, or what I aim to do, is always stick to the script and say what I've been asked to talk about. And so my focus is really going to be on transformative practice in education. Before I go further, I want you to understand, though, that the word transform, or to transform, or the process of transforming, it's not always an easy process. Transformation is painful and requires an acceptance of the fact that despite whatever accolades and whatever strengths we already have, to transform into a new dimension requires work, it requires energy, and sometimes it requires hearing some things that we may not necessarily want to hear. So as I celebrate you, I hope to also concurrently challenge you, because that is the task of transforming. You with me? So if I say something at some point that makes you really, really upset, just like walk out the room, go sip some tea like Kermit, and then come back, and then we'll figure some things out, all right? So I'm talking about this idea of thinking of our work as redefining friendship and re-understanding where the students that come before us are from. I'm a firm believer in the power and the potential of the hip-hop generation. I'm a firm believer, you can say yeah again. I'm a firm believer in the fact that when you go and buy an album, for example, and on that album cover there's a sticker at the bottom that says parental advisory, explicit content, that usually means completely stay away from that thing or whoever produced it. And I'm a firm believer in the fact that the same mechanism that can tell you to stay away can become the same mechanism that allows you to connect. And I'm rehashing or recreating that parental advisory, explicit lyrics content thing to become beware of progressive educational content. And the work of educators who truly want to transform requires a re-embracing of the same very things that we've been taught for a long time to stay away from. Y'all with me? I also want to take this approach, or this opportunity to say, I got my phone with me, so if as we speak, there are things that are particularly challenging or provoking or that you might enjoy, you can actually tweet me directly and I will respond during the speech. And the reason why I will respond during this speech is to provide an exemplar of sorts of what the hip-hop generation is and does. A keynote address for the hip-hop generation is not spewing out something that I read. It is living and breathing the existence to reflect the beliefs and the understandings of the populations in front of me. So holla at me as we speak so we could get this done. Next slide, please. Now, I'm oftentimes asked, you can move the next slide. You can move, thank you very much. I'm oftentimes asked, why is it that you do this work and that you advocate for hip-hop in this interesting way? And the reason why I do so is quite simple. Because I believe the one thing that we are not able to do in the most successful schools in the United States, particularly the most successful schools that teach urban youth of color, is teach them how to embrace hybridized identities. By hybridized identities, it means that this notion that to be academically successful and to be able to sort of reach the heights that you can in the academic and school domain does not necessarily mean an extraction of who you are and where you are from. And I say that to say this. That then requires an understanding of hybridity in every single piece of what we do as educators, from the teacher to the staff, to the folks who are ushering the kids in the school building every day. We have to be able to concurrently speak academically and speak in a language that reflects where we are from. The nature of what happens in academia is that we work oftentimes with urban youth of color to be able to reach heights that they may not have seen in their past. So we make them go every single year achieving great heights and doing better things and being better things. And what we forget to do oftentimes is as they go on to become better, we do not realize that we're concurrently teaching them to remove pieces of who they are from where they want to be. There's a misperception that the higher I go in education, the more degrees I attain, the more master's degrees, the more PhDs that I receive, the more times I get invited to fancy dinners with wine and grapes. It means then that I'm doing better and better. But the reality is, there is a deep issue within this nation amongst folks of color who receive an education. And that issue is this, that you go a whole long time trying to receive a formal education, and on the process of doing so, you never go back to your hood. And what happens when you no longer go back to your hood for long enough is that your hood no longer welcomes and accepts you. You become a person who's chasing an ideal that doesn't truly exist, and so you go on forever and ever. And at some point, you come faced with the reality that I'm knocking on a door for some folks who don't look like me or sound like me, who don't necessarily accept me to let me into their world, and they will let you sometimes all the way up to the door, but won't let you in. And if you get all the way to the door and you're not allowed to let in, and then you've separated yourself from your community for long enough, you are caught in the limbo where you have no home. And those who have no home are those who we view as those who are exceptional within our community. Why? Because they have good jobs, they make decent money, but they're such shells of who they authentically could be that it's sadder than not having an education at all. So when we go through this process, I want us to redefine this notion of friendship. When I say friendship, when I think of friendship, when I got the invitation to speak at a space that calls themselves friendship, I said, who do we want to be friends with? And the idea is that we have to be friends with those who don't have the same opportunities that we have because or by virtue of being in this amazing academic space. William Penn had this quote that says, "A true friend unbosoms freely, advises justly, assists readily, adventures boldly, defends courageously, and continues a friend unchangeably." So the questions we have to ask ourselves on the path to becoming friends and being friendship is, how are we unbosoming freely to? Who are we sharing our belief systems with? Who are we advising? Because we are in a space where we have information that others don't have. The work is not to become and create this club of amazing, beautiful things, and not to be able to share those ideals with those who don't have those same opportunities. Friendship is not to have friendship within those who are in the same space as you are. Friendship means to go back to the root and become and develop friendship with them. Friendship means understanding that as we stay in this space, we cannot completely celebrate where we are without an understanding of the dynamics that are going on in Ferguson. We cannot be in this space where we're focusing on academics without realizing that as the school year starts, young people need to have friends or be friends with folks who they don't see. They have to be deeply committed and committed to folks who are in spaces who are going through things that they have no idea how to imagine. They should be writing letters to those folks in those spaces. They should be thinking about Trayvon. We should be understanding the fact that these young people in front of us are going through a severe PTSD that can only be cured with friendship with those communities. And when I say PTSD, we oftentimes believe it's a post-traumatic stress disorder. But I'm talking about a post-Trayvon Martin stress disorder that has invaded the consciousness of young people. And sometimes when we're in these spaces where we sanitize them from reality, they become deeply entrenched in a deep depression and a deep misunderstanding of where they are because they don't have friendships with those in communities that can help them heal. Next slide, please. To do so, to have these friendships requires understanding this notion of a stem with no root bears no fruit. Stay with me now. A stem with no root. A stem with no root. You know, I love being around my people because sometimes when I say repeat with me now, a stem with no root, they will just say a stem with no root. Y'all know instinctively that you finished the sentence. It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing. My people. So, when we talk about a stem with no root bears no fruit, I bring to this work now where I am, how I position myself as a scientist and a mathematician, and this idea that, holla, you know what I'm saying? Because you know STEM folks rule the world. Just for the record, we make 26 times more money than the average citizen, so STEM workers. We know right now in California there are 1.4 million jobs in STEM that we just can't fill. So everybody in here should be cheering for STEM and seeing themselves as STEM professionals, all right? So when I say a stem with no root bears no fruit, it's simply this. When we talk biologically for a second, if I had a stem of a plant, and that stem of the plant is extracted from the root where it can grow, will that stem ever be able to bear a fruit? No. Why? Because it doesn't have the ground, it doesn't have the nutrients, it doesn't have, the things it needs to grow. At the same time, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, without a root, will also bear no fruit. The root that we're talking about here is going down to the dirt, into the grime of those communities to understand the inherent scientific and mathematical attributes of those who can be successful in STEM. Next slide, please. I push this further this way, to understand how folks before us have understood how to develop those friendships across STEM. So there you see the pyramids in their glory. Oftentimes, folks have looked at the pyramids as a powerful artistic endeavor. How were they to make those things look so beautiful? Well, do you know that decades and decades and decades and centuries even after the creation of the pyramids, there are still scientists and mathematicians today trying to understand the complex understandings of how folks were able to create those pyramids. What those folks in Egypt were able to do at that time is to create friendships between their artistic selves and their mathematical selves, knowing that as an artist, I'm also a mathematician, and I also have to understand the understandings of science and math in my communities, and that's how we're able to create the pyramids. They're not just artistic endeavors, they're scientific and mathematical endeavors. Y'all with me? I'm going to land in a second. If you see that second picture, these are of these tiles. And these tiles were developed by indigenous populations in Portugal. And these folks were creating these artistic tiles. And for a very long time, they said, wow, look at the beautiful tiles that were being created in Portugal by these people. Until we looked deeply and closer at those tiles and realized that they were decoding mathematical fractals within the creation of the patterns within those tiles. So we had populations who were marrying and creating friendships with the artistic and the scientific dimension to create these things. That other clip right there, the little image right there you see, is actually of the first speedometer. The first speedometer, which is a mathematical and an engineering feat that came from a marrying, a friendship to arts, because the guy was just drawing something that he thought could measure something interesting. Y'all with me so far still? Next slide, please. And so when I talk about this friendship and marriage, I'm also talking about the necessity for a marriage to our history. And our history is oftentimes the root. So please play that video. So you look puzzled. Where did this dude come and play for us? This, to me, is a notion of a stem with no root, bearing no fruit. This is who we want to create connections back to. These are young people in New Guinea who have no formal education, who are counting. But I want you to understand the complex thing about this counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You have these young people in New Guinea who've created a mathematical counting system with a base of 26. So when they count with their fingers, they keep going to these other joints in the body and going across, all to the point where they get to 26. So their base is 26. As they're counting, we usually think of the digits as the 10 things that are most significant. They're looking at other points within the human body between the two hands as significant as well, going beyond the digits. In counting to a base of 26, and by the way, the alpha system has, how many characters do you have in the alphabet? 26. You have young people without an understanding of a formal education, without ever going into schools, who are creating a complex mathematical system based on 26, aligned to an alphanumeric system, and then also saying it in what? Did you notice anything about what they were saying? Alpha, al-kada, al-mada. All those words were doing what? Rhyming. Through rhyme, different base systems, complex understandings of biological systems. They are recreating and rehashing and refashioning what it means to be scientifically and mathematically literate. They are contemporary versions of these young people right now in every hood in DC. Instead of counting with their fingers, they're counting in rhyme and counting bars. Instead of rhyming the numbers, they're rhyming in sentences. What would happen if, and here's transformative education, let's push this to another level. What would happen if we knew that this is a piece of the consciousness of the young people we are teaching, and we allowed that dimension of their understandings to be part of how we taught them in classrooms? What if we taught in meter and rhyme and reason and complexity and metaphor and analogy, because that's a piece of who we are as a people. Next slide, please. Let me push that further.
Can I be standing 5'10", I be rocking it when I be in your vicinity. Raw style synergy, recognize symmetry.
You can pause that, 'cause I don't want to run out of time.
Broke them down.
Thank you. They beat me to it. They beat me to it. See, in that process of the hip-hop cipher that you saw there, and you guys all know what a cipher is, there's oftentimes a misperception that youth who are not necessarily engaged in what's going on in classrooms are the ones who are engaging in that cipher process. Well, we've been able to find that traditional Western education requires students sitting attentively, like you guys are sitting now, while I am giving you the information and you're soaking in that information. We have discovered that young people from the hip-hop generation actually, when they're standing and engaging with each other in the solving of a problem, are actually more likely to be engaged in the process of teaching and learning. As they are standing there in that cipher, they're giving each other positive feedback. They're giving each other head nods. They're not saying, excuse me, please pick me, I'd like to rap next. They're just nodding their heads more visibly and more forcefully and saying, And by virtue of hearing that and seeing the movement, the person knows it's time for me to curtail my conversation and give you the baton to speak next. This is a piece of the consciousness of the young people that you have in your classrooms every day. Sometimes teaching them to follow a norm that is separate from who they are actually means doing them a disservice in teaching and learning and forcing them. Wait, hold up. And forcing them to ascribe to a version of teaching and learning that is divorced from their authenticity. That piece that we think we're doing just by teaching them normally is telling them that everybody who does not learn that way, those who you see in your hood who are in those ciphers, are less than who you are, chasing an ideal that is separate from who you authentically are. Next clip, please play that. Now, I'm just saying. Let's pause for a second. What if we learned to understand the nature of a Pentecostal pedagogy? What if we understood that when we go into the black church, when folks are catching the spirit like that, there's a complex understanding of teaching and learning that is going on. What if you looked at that scenario from the lens of somebody who's understood a formal education, it looks like complete chaos and they're just running around like they're crazy. But within that space, if the preacher starts to preach and it turns down? What if when he plays that music at a certain volume, it means to turn up? What if he says, can I get an amen? And the church just says, amen. What if when he starts opening a scripture and he starts reading and he stops, everybody knows intrinsically that it's time for them to pick up the information? What if he looks across the cloud and sees everybody bored and he says, you know what, brothers and sisters, just get up and go hug somebody? Do you think he's doing that all the time just because it's the Spirit? Or do you think he's doing that sometimes because he has a deep, complex understanding about how our people learn? Now, what if as educators we adopted those principles concurrently with allowing kids to meet standards? And listen, don't get it twisted for a second. I'm not saying that we don't have rigorous ideals. I'm not saying that we don't have rigorous standards. I'm not saying that the kids don't learn formal information. I am saying that if they're doing those things and they're not doing that on their own terms, then what's the purpose? Then is it truly transformative? Back to our history, I want you guys to just read this, and I'm going to close soon because I know I've been going for a while. Y'all learn, when people invite me to talk, they're like, just give that dude an hour or something. But I want you to read this if you can. This is an obituary for a man named Thomas Fuller. Thomas Fuller was a slave. He lived from 1810 to 1890. He died at the age of 80. And read this as I speak, because it's another thing that we understand is that you guys can read as I speak at the same time. You ain't got to be quiet while one person finishes. Y'all don't feel me, though. So as we go through this, Thomas Fuller, the slave, was called the famous African calculator in his time. He was able to have complex understandings of mathematical and scientific constructs, although he never had a formal education. There's folklore that says that one day Thomas Fuller was asked to come out from the slave quarters, and he was asked to stand around a whole bunch of other scientists and mathematicians. And because he always could calculate things quickly, they want to say, this guy's not as good as he thinks he is. So here goes Negro Tom, which is what they called him, and he stood there without a pen or paper because he didn't know how to read or write. Then you had all these other scientists and mathematicians flanked around him with all their pens and papers and all their tools for calculating. And they said, you know what, guys? I want everyone who's here to calculate the amount of days, weeks, months, hours, and seconds in a set of years from, say, 1815 to 1819. And so Thomas, because he couldn't read or write, just sits there and he just starts looking at the crowd. And everybody else around him does what? They get their calculators and they're calculating and they're trying to devise and find the answer to the equation. And this is all going on. It's building to this feverish pitch and this crescendo. So that at the end, one of the guys on the side says, I know the answer. I know the answer. And he gets up and he says, the answer is, and he spews out an answer. And then humbly, Negro Tom, the African calculator, he stands up and he looks as well. And he says, sir, with all due respect, but your answer is wrong. And it sounded like, if it was nowadays, they'd be like, World Star in the background. Like, it was a movement, right? You knew something was about to go down, right? And so he said, respectfully, your answer's wrong. And the guy says, no, how dare you say I am wrong? This is the answer, and this is the calculations. And then Thomas calmly says, but sir, you forgot to account for the number of leap years within that period in time. Think about that. The point here is this. Giving young people the tools to be able to make the proper calculations, the iPads, the ThinkPads, the technology, does not necessarily match up to the skill set that Negro Tom has. See, Negro Tom was able to make that calculation by doing what? I would argue an earlier version of the art of freestyle, calculating in his head and making sure he understood what happened. Sometimes having the tools to be successful, having the materials to be successful, only allows you to not forget the humanity, which is people live every day through leap years. By understanding the humanity, he was able to make a more deep and complex mathematical formula. Y'all with me? Next slide. I'm going to close soon. Imagine this night sky. Please press the clip. And this is a sort of technological rendering of what a night sky would look like. Then imagine Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman sitting, looking up the night sky as a slave, wondering how it is that I can guide these folks towards freedom. And the stars are plentiful. And this mathematical or this scientific model is in itself complex. And oftentimes we hear about Harriet Tubman as this person who freed the slaves, and this amazing narrative about what she's done. How often do we hear the narrative of her being a scientist? Because to be able to look at that night sky, identify Polaris amongst that simple constellation, understanding that that star then can lead to understanding how to go through geographic patterns to find a path to the north, is the kind of skill set that scientists today spend hundreds and thousands of dollars to recreate those models that she did intrinsically by just being who she is, by living and existing. When you understand that the students that you have in front of you are contemporary versions of Thomas Fuller and contemporary versions of Harriet Tubman, you understand then that to ignite their passions actually requires going to the base way of teaching and learning, which is just as organic as the cipher and just as organic as what happens when folks are catching the spirit in church. Last slide. Oh, this is not even my last slide, man. I was going to go somewhere else with this. Can I just talk about this real quick? Can you just let me? You know, I know I'm running out of time. Just for the record, there was a research study done by the National Institutes of Health that took young people who were engaged in hip-hop and who were in ciphers and had them hooked up to fMRIs, frequent magnetic resonance instruments, to find out what was going on in their brain activity as they were rhyming. The first discovery of the scientists was, oh my gosh, they have a complex vocabulary. That was actually a discovery. Like they don't use words when they rhyme, but that's a whole other conversation. The next discovery, though, was this. The medial prefrontal cortex of the brain, the part of the brain that controls active behavior, active learning, and engagement, was firing on multiple syllables, like on levels, when they were engaged in the process of freestyle. This is the part of the brain that controls learning. There's concurrently a different study that was done that looked at these same populations, which are kids who are able or more likely to exhibit hip-hop tendencies in classrooms. They hooked up fMRIs to them, and when they were doing this, they found that the dorsolateral region of the brain was acting funky. The dorsolateral region of the brain is the part of the brain that controls appropriateness and behavior. It's what's letting you know right now to sit down and not yell and scream as I'm teaching to interrupt you. Let's play this out. This means then that the parts of the brain that control what you want to be exhibited in formal classrooms actually get activated when they're in outside of classroom spaces, like engaging in hip-hop. And that during the traditional methods of teaching and learning, the parts of the brain that control appropriateness and behavior are not acting properly. Which means that if we engage in the kind of teaching practices that are for others and not for our young people, you're actually engaging in practices that force them to enact behaviors that allows the dorsolateral region to not engage properly in that classroom. When we talk about why there's so many suspensions of young men of color, and we oftentimes think it's a reflection of their inability to be successful within classrooms, it's actually it's a reflection of the inability of the classroom setting to be able to activate their medial prefrontal cortex, which is what's activated when they're outside of the classroom. Which is why I'm bringing to friendship today then that when we go into our classrooms, we are transforming our practices by engaging the kind of practices that will necessarily engage the medial prefrontal cortex. We're going to have them standing up. We're going to have them learning. We're going to have them engaged. We're going to have them walking and dancing in those hallways, because they could do that at the same time as they're learning their content. Let me close real quick. I'm going to close real quick with a couple of powerful quotes about education. Next slide, please. Skip that, please. They're going to have me back. Skip that, please. Skip that, please, because I'm running out of time. Thank you. We'll just close here with some powerful quotes about education that I want to leave you with, and that I hope charges you to look at this work differently. Albert Einstein, he says, education is what remains after one has forgotten what one has learned in school. Mark Twain said, I've never let my school interfere with my education. Tagore once says, do not limit a child to your own learning, for he was born in another time. And the final quote says, education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. What I want you guys to pull out of these quotes is simply this. There's a big difference between schooling and education. We have done successfully, and I say we because once I met y'all and I met your leader, I felt like it was part of the crew already. But we have done successfully schooling. We've got kids graduate. We got this amazing young man at Columbia. I don't know why he hasn't seen me on campus, but we have to make that happen. So we've done schooling very, very well. And we've done well in that domain. Now what we want to do is want to educate. And to educate, don't read all the red now. Let's read just the white. Education is what remains after school interferes with your learning. Or education can be what remains after school supports your learning. I'll close with this one final quote by Anais Nin. It's one of my favorite quotes. She's an amazing writer. And she says, sometimes, or at one point, the time came when the risk to remain in the bud was more painful than the risk it took to blossom. We've done well, y'all, but we've still remained within the bud. What I want you to do once the school year begins is make the decision to teach differently and to allow yourselves and your students to blossom. Thank you.